Hello, welcome all. Hopefully you are able to hear us pretty well here. Uh, Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our lecture, Cool Plants and Hot Garden Trends for 2020 with Mark Dwyer. This is Sam Burbach, the Education and Programming Coordinator at CLEM. And I want to thank you all for joining us. I would like to do a quick thank you to the Pauline J. and John R. Cook Lecture Fund of the Community Foundation of Northern Illinois, who is making this possible for us to have this program. We wish we could be face-to-face, but given the circumstances, we're happy just to see all these awesome plants and garden ideas from the comfort of our home. And so I'd like to briefly introduce Mark Dwyer, our presenter. He operates Landscape Prescriptions by MD. He's got degrees in landscape architecture and urban forestry. And many of you have seen him present before or know him as the previous director of horticulture at Rotary Botanical Gardens in Janesville, where he was for 21 years before taking on his own Landscape Prescriptions by MD. And without further ado, we're going to let Mark start presenting. There's a little question and answer bubble at the bottom of your screen. If you want to type in questions as you have them, Mark is going to wait until the end of the presentation to answer them, but it will be a text bubble so we can look over those at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, here's Mark.
Great, thank you, Sam. Well, good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be chatting with you this evening about plants. And I appreciate Sam's help with this. I'm not a real tech guy, but it's nice to be able to share some color. And as we segue into spring here, it's always nice to see what's new on the horizon and see some of the great color that's out there. And again, my background, I've been in Janesville here for over 20 years and worked at Rotary Botanical Gardens for 21 years. And if you haven't come north of the border recently, the gardens are still closed, unfortunately, due to world events, but we do hope you'll support your local botanic gardens. And you're certainly, if you're not a member of CLEM, we hope you'll do that as well and get out in your own yards. And that's part of the reason for sharing the color today, is to get motivated and get outside and see some neat things. So we're going to go through a lot of color, and I'm going to go at a pretty good clip. And to Sam's comment earlier, I'll address as many questions as I can at the end. But I will say, I believe there's a handout circulating in a digital format that you can get your hands on that lists not only all the plants you'll see, but also my email. So do feel free beyond tonight's presentation to email me independently. But we're going to dive right in, and this is my first Zoom presentation, so hopefully it'll go well. The image you see on the screen is a trial garden in West Chicago at Ball Seed Trial. But I think it's important to mention not only are plants that are new on the market exciting to look at, but a lot of the plants we're currently using are excellent as well. And in the next image, my definition of new isn't just something that's brand new on the market, because in a lot of instances, something may have been introduced in Europe or in another state or elsewhere, and it's new to us in the area. New to the availability stream, there's a lot of nurseries and places that are selling plants that might indicate something's new, but it's been out on the market for a little bit, just new to that place of business. So again, we're striving to have fun things in our gardens, but it goes beyond, again, some of these new things. But it is exciting to see the breeding that's going on and some of the great opportunity we have for a wide range of plants. What we'll talk about today will be some great annuals, perennials, and even some woody plants. And my last definition of new is stuff that you should know about that may not be brand new, but might be new to you. The image on the right, one of the relatively new false forget-me-nots, the Brunnerus, which are absolutely beautiful. You'll see that one come back here in a little bit. But the appeal of new plants, like this petunia you see on the left, the color speaks to us. And you've all been out in your spring gardens, and we're attracted to all this color as it materializes. Thankfully, we missed hard frost a couple days ago, but we're in the beginning of May here, where we still have some temperamental weather, and we'll see what happens. But do embrace the excitement of what's out there. And I know with today's challenges, knowing what nurseries are open or how to get your plants, it is becoming a little challenging. But rest assured, there's plants out there, and those vendors are working on ways to get them to you as the consumer. But temper the reality. What I mean by that is, availability may be an issue. We all have budgets. But the reality with new plants, and I use quote unquote, is that the marketing money that goes into promoting new plants is based on, again, getting the word out there with glossy photography, and certainly promoting plants that maybe don't have a wide range of trialing. They're out on the market faster than they've been trialed. So I have to admit, I'm a little wary sometimes of what's new. Not so much with annuals, but with perennials and some woody plants. And that relates to hardiness issues and some other things that may be problematic, again, in our climate, because we all know we have microclimates. We may know our hardiness zone, but it goes beyond that. The availability I alluded to earlier. When you see something new in a catalog or you hear about something, it's not always at the corner garden center. And I do want to back up and say, do patronize your local garden centers and nurseries. It's so important to do that. We all know the box stores, all the pharmacies, our grocery stores are selling plants, and we all like a good deal, and we like shopping local, but those ma and pa type nurseries and garden centers really need our help. Are the plants offered perhaps as a seed opportunity? You're purchasing them as seed, or are they vegetative, meaning have they been started as a plant? The petunia on the left is a great example. That's a petunia that's reproduced vegetatively. You won't find seed for that. So again, when you see something new, you need to know what format it comes in. And that really relates to many of the annuals in particular. Applicability in our yards and that duration of trialing, again, as it relates to has this plant seen a couple of our winters? Has it gone through a couple of seasons? And it's so great to see places like the Chicago Botanic Garden doing extensive perennial trials in particular, and some woodies, to really give us an idea what's the best of what's out there. And again, it doesn't mean it was introduced this year, hence my earlier sort of wide-ranging definition of new. This adage I've used in almost every presentation for 20 years, and not all new plants are good, and not all good plants are new. And what I mean by that is, a lot of times as we segue into some of the new stuff, the new kids on the block, so to speak, we don't want to abandon those plants we know that are solid performers, that are still being offered. And there's many wonderful plants that have been out there for 5, 10, 15, 20 years that are known entities. We know how they perform, and they should continue to be part of our palettes. Those tried and true plants, again, that performance is something we understand. The availability, again, becomes a challenge, but again, some of those old favorites may be out there. Wonderful Million Bells on the right, one of the brand new ones in the Cabaret series. So we're going to dive into annuals. And again, I'm going to go at a pretty good clip. And if you had not visited Rotary Gardens up in Janesville, annually we would plant about 150,000 seasonal plants, about 900 varieties. Some of them were started from seed. Many were vegetative, like the coleus you see in the center here. That's one called Inferno. So a wide-ranging approach to annuals for seasonal color, keeping in mind these are plants that we'll only see one season out in our gardens. And botanically speaking, an annual is a plant that goes from seed to seed in one season, like a cosmos or a marigold, a plant that will grow, bloom, and die and reproduce. I'm using a broader definition of annual as a seasonal plant, something that's not typically hardy, maybe hardy in a warmer climate, but we're using it for seasonal interest. And as we segue away from this image, I do want to say, look, you're seeing some flower power here, but look at the prevalence of foliage with some dark foliage, some light foliage, silvers. Foliage is a wonderful component, not only offered from annuals, but many of our other plants. And when you're dedicating sacred real estate out in your gardens, you want your plants to have multiple features of interest. Certainly wonderful blooms, but maybe interesting foliage, neat texture, fragrance, wildlife potential. Again, get more bang for the buck from every plant you're putting out. I'll go through these pretty quickly. I think some people feel petunias are ubiquitous. I don't at all. The danger with petunias, unfortunately, is the last 3 summers you've had in northern Illinois and that we've had in southern Wisconsin have been quite wet and cool. And petunias like it hot and a little on the drier side, to be honest. And they're workhorses in terms of blooming. And the Starlit Velvet is one of the really dark velvety colors. There actually are now black petunias and green petunias. So then there's actually so many great selections out there. And at Rotary Gardens, we leaned on a lot of different varieties of petunias. But to my earlier comment, the danger with cooler, damper summers was some rotting issues. and a lot of overhead irrigation. If you have petunias getting overly wet or in wetter soils, you may have challenges. So know how to grow these things as we're looking at them. But petunias also know their form, not just height, but there's now petunias, there's easy wave, there's tidal wave. One plant can take up a lot of real estate. So do know what you're getting into with the size. I'll let the names speak for themselves, but I love the striped petunias like Shortcake Blueberry. This Color Rush series is excellent for heavy flower production, but Merlot Star, you see hints of white going down into the throat of the plant. I grew up with my mom. My mom was my inspiration for gardening, and we would go out and pinch petunias and pinch marigolds. The idea there being deadheading, removing spent blooms to encourage the plant to continue to bloom. Most of the modern annuals now are either self-cleaning or just will continue to keep producing. So it's not as imperative to get out there and snip back, but if you end up getting scraggly petunias or they seem to be thinning, cut them way back and then time a nice fertilizer application. And as a general comment, annuals are heavy feeders, and we know plants make their own food, but the fact that these annuals, whether they're in containers or garden beds, good soil is certainly warranted. But at Rotary Gardens, we would fertilize our annuals 5 times during the growing season. So from mid-May through early September, every 3 weeks we were applying a liquid fertilizer to give them a boost, to get more flowers. It was usually a balanced mix, something that had a nice balanced nutrient mix. This is a crazy looking petunia, this midnight gold, black petals with yellow highlights. A lot of folks might not see this as a petunia, but really exciting developments in breeding. And here's one of those petunias that'll take up a lot of real estate, the Wave series. Some of you remember Purple Wave that came out many, many years ago. Carmen Velour is relatively new with a reddish tint to it. And that's only 3 plants taking up about 100 square feet. So great softening the edge of a sidewalk here. It will overwhelm a container, so do know, again, what you're getting into. A lot of the petunias I'm showing you are actually vegetatively offered as plants, but there are still great varieties from seed. This Easy Wave series is an example, but wonderful blue. And I'm a huge fan of blue in the garden, and as a general comment, well beyond the discussion on annuals here, is I think blue is often overlooked in the garden. And a great example would be now, exploring your landscapes. We're seeing, we saw the bright forsythias, the daffodils, we're seeing wonderful bright tulips, and a lot of warm colors. The blues are imperative throughout the season, and that certainly includes the summer, where this petunia would look great in a basket, a container, or in the ground. You saw this earlier in an image. The calibrachoas are million bells, sometimes called mini petunias. First, I want to jump and cut to the chase and say, they really thrive in containers where there's adequate drainage and you're able to do supplemental fertilization. Calibrachoas in the ground tend to suffer a little, particularly with that cold and wet that I mentioned. So we relegated them strictly to containers, and we've fed them a lot of fertilizer. Keep in mind, calibrachoas, of which there's literally hundreds of varieties, come in mounded form, semi-trailing, and trailing form. The trailers being great for the edge of a container or a hanging basket. The flower count is amazing. It's hard to see scale with these, and if you've not grown them, you should know the flowers are only about 3/4 to an inch in diameter, but there's a lot of them. The Can series, Bumblebee Pink, if you look into the throat of those flowers, that little yellow highlight is supposed to look like a bee right in the center there. So calibrachoas and petunias tend to have a gradation of color from the outer petals all the way into the throat. Huge fan of calibrachoas, and there's literally dozens and dozens of new ones every year. Again, they're heavy feeders, and they don't mind acidic fertilizer like amure acid. A little lower pH benefits them as well. And these double forms are exciting. This is very subtle in a pastel range, but this Plumtastic, imagine this combined with other pastels. Pachoa, now you see the little X Pachoa. Pachoas are a combination, it's an intergeneric hybrid. They're actually called super bells, I think is the other term, because Pachoas doesn't roll off the tongue, but in essence, this is a hybrid between what you saw previously. It's a combination of petunia and calibrachoa, hence Pechoa. But what you're getting here is a wider color range and a lot of great coloration. And the Super Cal series has 7 or 8 colors, Lavender Star being one of many. But do look for these Pechoas out in the local garden centers. They read visually as a petunia, but I think there's a lot of exciting potential coming through. And here's Lobularia. This is Sweet Alyssum. This is another flower I grew up. I mentioned with my mom, we were pinching petunias and marigolds. At the end of the season, we were always tearing up the Sweet Alyssum and shaking out the seeds onto the soil for the next season. So my mom perpetuated the same Lobularia for 20 years, but now variegated Lobularia, frosty lavender. There's also a yellow form. The comment here, and this is a close-up, if you know Sweet Alyssum, nice fragrance, particularly at dusk, but very small flowers, quite frost tolerant, incidentally. It'll bloom into November, but the extra bang with variegation. And that is something I think that's exciting with a lot of perennials. I'm a variegated nut. I love variegation, and in this case, I think it works well. And here's that frosty lemon. So again, very light variegation. You're seeing it here in a basket, but would work well in the ground as well. Annual verbenas don't mind the heat. They definitely need full sun. And you're going to see a couple here, but what I want to mention about annual verbenas is, first of all, we really hope for 90-degree days because they'll thrive in it. Verbenas tend to peter out as you get into September, late August, early September. And what I would recommend is a severe cutback, which sounds kind of contrary because they're still looking pretty good, but you're seeing them look a little thinner and thinner. This would coincide with one of your last fertilizer applications. And by doing a severe cutback followed up by fertilization, they'll rebound quickly and bloom all the way till hard frost in October. So to extend the bloom, don't be shy about cutting your verbenas back. But let's look at a couple here. This Lascar Vampire, a nice true red. The flowers are in an umbel, a cluster, blooming from the outer edges. The new flowers in the center haven't bloomed yet in this case, but they're blooming machines. They're excellent. There are seed-grown verbenas, but a lot of what you're seeing here you'd have to find as a plant. And again, that's the challenge. I've encouraged you to patronize local vendors, but there are mail order resources for many of these as well. In the Samayer series, look at the bicolor look on these petals. 5-petaled flowers, excellent, again, in the full sun garden. And something a little milder here on the eyes, magenta splash. So when you think of impact with annuals, there's the 55-mile-an-hour annuals. Those are clusters of bright reds and yellows that you literally can see as you drive by. The subtlety in an annual like this, placement closer to a path or in a container or a basket where you can see it up close, the nuances of the subtlety of interest, for lack of a better term, is where this has a lot of value. So consider viewing angles on these annuals. They're certainly part of your compositions, but sometimes the distance from the viewer to the annual will dictate your selections as well. If you want to attract hummingbirds, look at salvias. Perennial salvias, this is an annual salvia, a new one, Roman red. The trumpet-shaped flowers are a slam dunk for hummingbirds, no doubt about it. I will say that red isn't essential for attracting hummingbirds. We've been taught for years that that's the case, but it's really the shape of the flower. And at a 30-inch height, this is a great plant. And to an earlier comment about deadheading, if you see the spires or spikes of these flowers starting to wane, you can snip them way back into the foliage and you'll get continued bloom through the hottest of summers. There's a wide range of salvias. Purple and bloom, some of you might know black and blue is very similar. These are not hardy in any way, shape, or form, but this is also a slam dunk for hummingbirds, as is black and blue. So a subtropical sage getting about 3 feet tall, but just smothered with these trumpet-shaped blossoms. Lantana is another great plant for wildlife, particularly butterflies and hummingbirds. In warmer climates, they've had a tendency to be reseeding nightmares, and out on the market, that's not a factor for us in the Midwest, but on the market, there's a lot of breeding for sterility, not having the reseeding problem. But hot-blooded is actually one of the hottest new lantanas in the last decade, getting close to a near red, but most lantanas have a progression of color from the newest flowers in the center to the oldest and aging flowers on the outer edges, blooming very similar to the verbena you saw earlier. Lantanas like it hot. There's also different forms in terms of trailing and semi-trailing, and also more rounded and clump formers, but absolute full sun for lantanas. And here's a bunch of hot-blooded together. they'll bloom well through the summer and do wonderfully. And Bloomify is one of the sterile series. And look at this wonderful mango. Most lantana don't need to have any deadheading or pinching, but it certainly doesn't hurt, and they would benefit from your fertilization regimen as well. Moving on to dahlias, I visit trial gardens around the country every year, and the breeding in dahlias is amazing. And I'd love to see the large dinner plate dahlias. People who seriously grow dahlias, it's really amazing to me. But a lot of those taller forms need additional staking and a lot more TLC. But the breeding in more compact dahlias under 30 inches in height, like this Venti series, Tequila Sunrise being one of many varieties, absolutely wonderful for summer blooms. And if you've grown dahlias, you know that they bloom stronger as you get into late summer. And you certainly can dig and store the tubers, which would be a discussion for another time, but you can certainly perpetuate dahlias year after year. And the fact that these are shorter, they lend themselves to the front and midpoint of the sunny border, and don't need the staking in as much help. And I think I've got a couple more here in that Venti series. Passion fruit, you can remove spent blooms as they appear, but there's some great varieties out here. And Venti, the pink with white eye, another series. I have so many photographs of dahlias over the years. I haven't seen one that I don't like. I don't have photos of them today, but there is a series called the Mystic series out of New Zealand, and you might want to jot that down independently, because the Mystic series has near black foliage and a color range of 8 or 9 different flower colors, from bright red to bright yellow to orange to pink, hovering over black foliage. So you have the benefit of foliage and bloom. Summer snapdragons, angelonias. They're excellent for full sun, very upright flowers, similar to a salvia in its appearance. But if you look closely, the individual flowers on the stalk are very orchid-like in appearance. And these are blooming powerhouses. You don't have to deadhead. Adequate water is important. The fertilizer certainly doesn't hurt. Most angelonias will not get over 15 to 18 inches, so do know that. There's a lot of vegetative offerings, but if I were to pick 5 of my favorite categories of annuals, angelonia would fall in there, because I've never had a patch of angelonia that I've planted where I've said, boy, that's not doing well. I always comment on how well it's doing. And there's a patch of that same angelonia in midsummer. And it runs in the blues, the whites, the purples. Tagetes, this is marigold. Big Duck Gold is an All-America selection winner. The flower, for perspective, is about 3 inches in diameter. And there's a lot of marigolds in that 12 to 15 inch range. This one's a little bit taller than that. But with marigolds, I don't think they'll ever be ubiquitous, because not only are they tough in the garden, but they continue to look good all the way till frost and sometimes beyond. And there's Big Duck Gold and Big Duck Yellow. I love the larger flower forms on very sturdy stalks, so they're not floppy at all. And another great Tagetes is Flamenco. Look at the highlights. I think we should look at all our flowers up close, to be honest, to really see the detail, because marigolds have gone well beyond the bedding plant you purchase in a 4-pack or 6-pack. They're workhorses in the full sun garden, and Flamenco's an excellent one. Here's a nice cluster in a container. They're actually now true red marigolds as well. So they've broached that barrier, and they're getting close to pure white. You know, there's some very close to white ones as well, but do explore the range of these marigolds. Osteospermums, the African daisies, native to South Africa. The warning I'm going to start with is, if we have a hot summer, these aren't huge fans of a hot summer. So you'll see them thriving in your late May to June into early July garden, and then they start to wane a little in terms of blooms. You're advised to deadhead to remove spent blooms, and these will perk up again as you get into September and October. But when it's getting into 85, 90 degrees, they start shutting down for bloom. And they're frequently used in cool season annual arrangements, but they're absolutely gorgeous. The Zion series, Morning Sun, is a great one. Look at the color on Purple Sun here. This is actually a summer shot, so they're still doing okay, but it hadn't quite reached the mid 80s yet. And I'm a huge fan of zinnias. In the cooler, damper summers that we've had, mildew can be an issue. Most modern zinnias now are mildew resistant, but powdery mildew can be prevalent with those wet conditions on just about anything. But the Zesty series is known for compact form with double flowers. And I will say, if you're into pollinators, bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, you can't go wrong with zinnias. And there's just such a wide range of old-fashioned zinnias, a lot of the taller forms, flowers that are double like this, single forms, semi-doubles. A couple more of the zesty series I'll go through pretty quickly, but you start to see some of the beautiful colors here. In the Preciosa series, another compact series. So instead of taller zinnias that might be in that 3 to 5 foot range, you're here only 15 to 18 inches. So front of the border, still great as a cut flower. General comment about double flowers you should know if you're interested in the pollinator angle. A lot of double forms of annuals and perennials, the double petals is frequently at the expense of pollen and nectar production. So the single forms of cone flowers, zinnias, cosmos, tend to have more value for pollinators. So do know that. Although I will say double zinnias seem to still get a lot of visitation from pollinators. Gomphrenias, globe amaranths, truffula pink is new. Absolutely beautiful, great as a dried flower as well. It loves the heat and sun. And you can see it in mass in the left. That's a trialing row, but you can see how beautiful that is. And they run the gamut. In that image to the left, you can see some red ones in the upper right, the oranges, whites, pinks. So Gomphrenias are in all your seed catalogs. They're very easy to grow and very heat tolerant. Horton's Revenge here, also known as solar flare. All that gold foliage is the foliage of the plant. You see the hovering pink blooms. This is a vegetative. You have to order this as a plant. And at Rotary Gardens, we planted 3 of them. And I just love, when you think pink over gold, when you say it, doesn't sound good until you start to see it. And I'm sure the blue in the background from the ageratum helps in this composition. But here's a case where wonderful glowing foliage helps augment the flowers and vice versa. Now, Bidens, a comment about Bidens, 20 years ago, I wouldn't talked about Bidens in a show like this simply because it was sort of a ubiquitous filler, heat tolerant for baskets and containers that always ran the gamut of yellows and oranges. And definitely a good plant, but just not real well known. Breeding in Bidens now to incorporate hints of orange and red has been truly amazing. So Bidens are one of the hottest annuals out there. Blazing Embers is one of dozens now. You're seeing a close-up of the blooms, which are about 2 inches in diameter, but you still have the heat tolerance, heavy flower production, but they're not just a filler in your compositions. They're still excellent in baskets and containers, but they are primary interest annuals. And most are vegetative. You're finding these as plants, but just gorgeous. And here's a more modest colored one here, the Stockatuka series. Notice the yellow, very light pastel yellow around white petals. And another great one. Kufiyas or cigar flowers. Honeybells is a new variety. These are about 1.5 inches. This is an extreme close-up, and the next image will show you what the plant looks like. But hummingbirds absolutely will flock to this. Great in a container, heavy flower production. Lots of different kufiyas out there, including what are called bat-face kufiyas, which have a different look to them, but also have a trumpet-shaped flower arrangement. Kufia as a genera is ubiquitous will attract hummingbirds. They're excellent for that. Here's what the plant looks like. And that's 3 plants in a container, but look at the heavy flower production. Just amazing. And hummingbirds will certainly be. The flowers are minuscule. I'm just going to pop to the next image to show you. It looks almost like a baby's breath in appearance. So very wispy. And at 18 to 24 inches tall along this edge, offering some softening, and that pink doesn't really show till you get a little closer. So here's a case of a very light pastel arrangement, but the textural contribution of the plant, I think, is as important as the flowering. And there's another image of it as a little spiller in a container. Now, Catharanthus, I didn't mention the first image with the title slide. All those rows in a trial garden were annual vincas or Madagascar periwinkles. This Catharanthus, very popular annual. Here's a trailing form. So they're now having trailing forms for the basket. Catharanthus is heat tolerant. They're wonderful plants. Flowers are about 1 inch in diameter. And just as a side note, there's a lot of breeding cancer research based on this plant. It seems to have a lot of potential for fighting a wide range of cancers. So that's great to hear. This Sori season, or the Kauai series, it's hard to see here, but the flowers are quite small, but there's a lot of them. The flowers are only about a ½ inch in diameter. There's, I think, 5 colors in this series, but they're really dynamo. And when I first saw this plant, I thought, boy, it looks like an annual vinca. And sure enough, it was. The foliage is a little smaller than what you might expect as well, but these are coming out on the market, and it's worth putting them out in your full sun garden. And if you like wispiness, you saw that fairy dust kufia earlier, this diamond snow, the euphorbias. There's been a lot of these the last 10 years out in the market, these baby's breath-like euphorbias. Diamond snow has semi-double flowers, so it looks like this for 4 months. And so having it out in your containers in June, July, August, and September, it's looking spectacular and doesn't overpower other plants. It does a lot better in a container than in the ground. And I think drainage might be an issue with that. There's probably 15 to 20 varieties of these types of euphorbias, but diamond snow is just excellent for being almost solid flowers. Solenensimum, a long word for really coleus. And general comment about coleus, they're awesome. There's still a lot of seed-grown varieties you can find and start your own seeds. Most are vegetative. You're finding these as plants. Now, Heartbreaker is relatively new, but the comment about coleus is, number one, they're not shade plants. They never really were, and they've been relegated to our shady gardens for 100 years. They can take a lot more light than people give them credit for, and you might recall about 15 years ago they came up with the term sun coleus, promoting a range of coleus that take full sun. Most coleus will take full sun, with the exception of the brightest yellows. Need some degree of afternoon shading. It's really a moisture issue. So coleus like really rich soils, adequate moisture, drainage is important. But with coleus, know what you're getting into, number one, with height, because there's coleus that will get literally 30 to 40 inches in our Midwest climate. That's shrub size. There's some that are fist size. They're extremely small. But the nuances of the leaf are important to examine too, because there's cut leaf, there's scalloped edges, there's very fine textured coleus. Sometimes the back of the leaf is different. So their contribution is through color. And whenever you see them bloom, pinch those flowers back and let them do their thing. And I wish I'd love to do an entire talk on coleus. There's so many out there, and they're not hard to take a pinching and propagate and carry them over from year to year as well. But a topic for another time. We'll go through some here. The Chartres Street, the Main Street series out of the University of Florida is excellent. What you're not seeing here is there's a shade cloth over this patch for some afternoon shading, but the chartreuse and gold ones really read in the landscape, but here's a plant that's 30 inches tall, so that's a beach ball size. So again, that contribution is significant, and when you're thinking about compositions, containers, do know what you're getting into for size. I think the breeding in coleus is just unbelievable. So see what's out at your local garden centers. Ruby Punch is relatively new. Notice the lime green edge on that scalloped edge. Reggae salmon, now there's a very elongated cut leaf with a lot of pastels to it. So, you know, I won't write poems about these things, but I tell you, I could wax poetic about the benefits in the garden for these. And coleus, again, majority will take full blazing sun, and do know that. In shade, they actually languish, and I will say this plant, what you're seeing here, reggae salmon planted in full sun, part sun, and deep shade, has a totally different look. All coleus, depending on the degree of light, have a different gradation or of their color, so to speak. So do know that. And that's not necessarily bad, it's just something to know. The comment about impatiens, I think many of you know standard impatiens, impatiens downy mildew, came our way and your way about 7-8 years ago, and started wiping these plants out, the standard impatiens walleriana. This is the same patch, by the way. I'll back up and say that patch, when we dodged the bullet for years, we knew the mildew was coming, but there was a day where these looked a little peaked, and within 3 days, that's what they looked like. They dropped most of their leaves, and our volunteers dug them all up, bagged them, and that soil, we weren't supposed to plant that type of impatiens for 5 to 6 to 7 years. We weren't interested in going that route because we knew mildew would continually be a problem. So we started leaning on New Guinea impatiens, and they're resistant to that mildew. The Sun Patience collection out of Japan is absolutely wonderful. And you're paying more per plant. These are vegetative offerings. And there's a wide range of colors, including some with variegated foliage. But to fill the same space, we were spending more money, if you catch my drift. But New Guinea impatiens, there's a lot of these, including the Sun Patience series, the Bounce series, Big Bounce, that will get sizable, 24 to 30 inches in a season. So again, knowing mature size becomes important. These do need some degree of shade. Even they're being called sun patients, some afternoon shade is certainly welcome, but do understand moisture is imperative. Here's a full sun display of these sun patients. Notice in the foreground a variegated form, and in this case, in-ground irrigation, keeping these things nice and damp. And a relatively new one, beautiful in bloom as you get closer, compact pink cotton candy. This compact tropical rose, love the variegation. Same plant, if you look on the left, that's in more sun. Notice the variegation is more prevalent. And on the right, in more shade, still some nice variegation, but looking, I have just a little less color to that variegation. These plants will take a lot of shade as well, but you'll get more size and vigor with adequate sunlight. So I want to mention beacon impatiens. The breeding, once downy mildew wiped out this massive market for standard impatiens, they've now come out with the Beacon series, and I'm drawing a blank. There is another series of Impatiens Walleriana out there besides the Beacon series that are resistant to downy mildew. And what they've done with their trialing is infected these plants over the years. And we tried them the last 2 years at Rotary Gardens and didn't see a lick of mildew on them. We saw no issues, no suffering. So you'll start to see your garden centers and nurseries carrying these mildew-resistant impatiens. And I'd feel comfortable recommending them. So if you want to get back to those standard impatiens, do look into this series. And gosh darn, I can't remember the other series, but there are 2 that are out there. And a close-up of the Beacon series, running the gamut of 5 colors currently. Begonia, so the Viking series, there's a lot of begonias that have come out on the market that have the benefit of not only taking a wide range of sun conditions, because these will take shade all the way till full sun, but these hybrid begonias have the benefit of a wide range of foliar colors, from green to bronze to near chocolatey, and flower coloration from pink to red. In the past, there's been some wonderful series, and they're still great, that have been offered. The Whopper series is out there, the Big series, the Megawatt series. Now the Viking series comes out and is absolutely excellent. We've used them as bedding plants, keeping in mind the size of all 4 of those series I mentioned, including Viking, is getting into the 18 to 24 inch range. So these aren't your standard bedding wax begonias. These are getting bigger. But this Viking XL Red on Chocolate, this is an All-America Selection winner here in a full sun trial. Nice chocolatey foliage, glossy, and heavy flower production. These are absolute workhorses in the garden. Do understand that the word begonia is never conducive to a droughty situation. Begonias need ample watering, but they need good drainage. And some of your shadier begonias, we're going to get into some of those shortly, the drainage is imperative because rotting with the crown and roots can be a problem with begonias. There's that same begonia, the XL Viking Red on Chocolate. This Canary Wings begonia came out about 5 years ago. And I have to admit, the first time I saw it, I'm like, yeah, you know, I don't know, chartreusey foliage. And it grew on me. And I'm a huge fan of this because it illuminates a partly shaded area. In more shade, that foliage reads as chartreuse. In more sun, it reads as gold. There's a fine line, though. In full blazing sun, you can get some crispiness to the leaves. So some degree of shading is important. Here in a basket, there's 3 plants, and it's semi-cascading, so it could be used in a basket, but also in bedding schemes. Here it is in full sun. I wanted to show you because if you look closely at some of those leaves, they're getting a little peaked. They're starting to curl and roll, but that gold really pops. And all sorts of other begonias out there. I don't want to throw a ton of Latin at you, and this would be on that slide list when you get it, as well everything I'm talking about in terms of plant lists, both Latin and common names. But Bossa Nova, this night fever papaya, is one of the many, many, many Begonia boliviensis types. And these begonias can take full sun, they can take quite a bit of shade. They really lend themselves to elevated containers and baskets because the trumpet-shaped blooms tend to dangle. But the benefit to a variety like this is colorful flowers over dark foliage. And begonias are great for hummingbirds, and I was real excited to see this one, but there's such a wide range of begonias out there. And to my earlier comment about begonias for more shade, the Rex type begonias, those that you're not growing these for flowers. Although if you look in the exact center of that image, there are some scant flowers coming up. It's the foliage, this cherry mint, absolutely wonderful foliage. These are not fans of repeated overhead irrigation or overly damp soils, certainly not clay. They did really well for us in shady locations on a slope where there was some drainage and rich soils. And cherry mint's a nice one. Look at black cherry, unbelievable. And I'm going to dive right into perennials. And I tend to get verbose, and I don't want to, I know it's the dinner hour. Hopefully you're having a snack as we go through this. But I know how many slides I have left here, so we're gonna keep humming along here. But the false forget-me-nots, Brunneras, excellent for shade tolerance. Here you see a collection in a shady location. They also, deer don't nibble on them. They have sandpapery-like leaves, and if you've grown them, you know what I'm talking about. Very little problems with slugs or earwigs on the leaves. So the foliage is important. Every one of these plants, the common name is false forget-me-not because they get beautiful bluish flowers in April. They're actually blooming very shortly here, but it's the foliage that carries the show. And you see gold forms, various degrees of variegation and silvering, and it's exciting to see continued development in these because when you think about shady gardens, the illumination of providing silver and yellow in shadier spots from foliage is what offers that punctuation. And we can have flowers in the shade, there's no doubt, but it's the foliage that'll steal the show. Sea Heart, a great one, that silver patina. Developments and selections in Brunner now are for more silvering and certainly larger leaves. And a lot of the breeding has been for heat tolerance, which isn't as relevant for us in our summers. It's primarily further south when these plants tend to melt out in the extreme heat of the south. Silver Heart's a great one for a lot of silver. Some of you know Looking Glass was the precursor to this with a lot of silver to it. Queen of Hearts is another great one. And I'll let the images speak for themselves. Jack of Diamonds, I think this is one of my favorites. What you're not seeing for scale, and I think I've got an image here. The leaves are enormous. And a couple of years ago, there's a variety called Jack Frost. That's one of my favorites. Very similar, I'll back up. Jack Frost is like a miniature version of this Jack of Diamonds. Imagine this with just smaller foliage. Then Alexander's Grape came out, which was a little bigger. But what really worked out well was Jack of Diamonds ended up being extremely large in terms of foliage. And I'm going to interrupt and just say for Sam, if she's listening, I just had an image come across my screen about my internet connection being a little goofy. So if for some reason I cut out, please call my cell phone so I don't chat to myself here, but hopefully we're still going. But back to the silvering. Sterling silver you saw earlier, but really love the coloration. So coral bells, we'll go through these pretty quickly. The thing about coral bells, if I were to ever do, and I have done, presentations on low maintenance perennials, I've never included coral bells. In my experience, I've probably killed more than I've established. I've never met a coral bell I didn't like, and many have beautiful blossoms, no doubt about it, but you're planting them for the foliage. You want that 5 to 6 months of foliage color. Do understand that they're needy in terms of rich soils. They like the moisture. They need good drainage, and they need more light than people give them credit for. They're not a shade perennial. So keeping them happy is important, but as we kind of came through March here, one of the other issues, and some of you have experienced this, their woody crown tends to heave out of the soil with the freezing and thawing so a lot of them kind of throw themselves out of the soil and desiccate and dry up. So we've seen heucheras wither and wane over the years. So keeping them happy and nurturing becomes important. The foliage coloration is sometimes a lot more intense in spring and then goes through gradations of color. And do understand many coral bells actually have an excellent fall color. Leave the foliage up on all coral bells through the winter. Let that help insulate the crown. But back to the colors. Twist of Lime, I'll let these speak for themselves. The Dolce series is excellent. Appletini with chartreuse leaves with a little silver. Notice the wonderful flowers as well. Hence the name coral bells, and most have beautiful blooms, but again, that foliage is the longer contributor. Red Lightning, hints of red through the venation on that. What an excellent selection. And I'm a big fan of the dark forms. Keep in mind, I mentioned earlier in our shady or partly shaded locations, the importance of illumination, yellows and whites. Dark colors help offer depth and are great foils for that. Something like cherry truffles can take a lot of sun, you should know that. And the glossiness in the leaf, I think, is a nice contribution as well. Developments in Heuchera are now leading towards almost near black foliage. But again, that I think moisture and good soil is something we're not always providing. Look at the red coloration on this Forever Red. Just spectacular. The intensity of that new growth does wane in the heat of our summers, but you still get a hint. And for our northern climate, this northern exposure series, I think there's 3 colors, really another nice one. And we first saw reds, true reds and coral bells about 8 years ago, and they're just getting better and better. And my favorite black foliage Heuchera was Black Pearl. Extremely glossy, again, can take quite a bit of sun given ample moisture. And then we ran into Timeless Night, which I thought was even darker. So you have to decide how these work, but again, they don't read visually from a distance. They're nice in mass plantings, but combining them with lighter hostas or again, using them as a foil for depth and richness becomes important. And that silvering can be provided by the foliage of many Heucheras. The silver gumdrop, notice in this composition how it pops and offers a lot of interest. And here in this partly shaded composition, you're seeing almost no flowers, but your eye is already traveling through seeing a lot of color, and that's due to the foliage. And there's a lot of oranges out there, pinky orange types. Rio, you should know this is its spring growth, and then it ages out to a more of an amber coloration. There are some really good oranges out there that stand the distance. And to throw just a little more Latin at you, that in our climate, any Heuchera that has villosa, that's a species, villosa parentage, Heuchera villosa type coral bells tend to withstand our hot summers better and are just universally better. So look for villosa type Heucheras or do a little research and you'll find many varieties. As we talk about shaded gardens, ferns are sometimes relegated just as textural components, but Rotary Gardens has one of the largest fern gardens in the country. We have 250 varieties of ferns, including a lot of these wonderful painted ferns. And Silver Falls we found to have the most silver to it. And this is a plant that's about 15 inches tall, but wonderful silver. There's 20 to 30 varieties of Japanese painted ferns with different degrees of silver and maroon. But ferns, ample moisture becomes important, and your success with growing any fern is based on understanding how it grows natively, what sort of moisture and soil it likes. So try to replicate that. Ghost is a wonderful hybrid fern. This is a case of combining painted fern with lady fern, native lady fern. So you're getting a 30-inch tall, you're getting the height and hardiness of the lady fern parent, but the silvering of the painted fern parent. Ghost is absolutely wonderful. This Godzilla, very similar hybrid, lady fern, painted fern hybrid, but a little more purple to it. So in this case, offering interest texturally. And I won't, hostas are wonderful, and many of your hosta aficionados, and you certainly love them for the foliage. This Rainbow's End I find quite striking because of that foliage, but developments for colorful petioles or stems are out there. There's hostas with hints of red in the leaves. There's minuscule miniature and dwarf hostas. There's massive ones. We all know there's issues with slugs and earwigs and some other problems with hostas, but join your local hosta society, talk to people who know more about these plants, and realize they're not just workhorses in the garden, they're primary components, particularly in our shade gardens. They're excellent plants. Water slide is just another nice one, but look at the textural rippling on the leaves in that situation. If you have any degree of shade, you should all have this plant. This is the plant of the year this year, I believe. Sun King Aurelia, perennial plant of the year as selected by the Perennial Plant Association. But Sun King, what you're getting is a subtropical looking plant. Now this is not native. This is native to Japan and Korea. It's normally as green and has been in our domestic gardens for years in the green form, but Sun King was found about 12 years ago. And I'll show you a whole bunch of images for it, but it's a plant that's going to get 4 to 5 feet in your partly shaded garden. In deep shade, it breeds as chartreuse. In a lot of light, like you see here, it gets a lot more gold. I would not put it in full sun because it tends to get crispy, similar to that Canary Wings Begonia you saw earlier. So give it some degree of shading, but plan on a shrub-sized plant. Herbaceous, this is going to die back to the ground every year, but I'm rambling on. Let's look at this thing. It's just absolutely gorgeous. Notice the very few leaves have been compromised by any problems. It's fabulous in the garden. Now, the full sun garden, sedums or stone crops, they've gone through some botanical name changes, but we'll call them, that's the same plant, out of flower and in flower. With the ground cover type sedums, know what you're getting into for real estate, that they'll start to cover, but in this case, along a hot sidewalk, offers maroon and pink is excellent. Dazzleberry being one of many in what's called the Sun Sparkler series. So there's taller sedums, there's ground cover sedums, the majority bloom in late summer, great for pollinators. Most are not native, so do know that, but they are tough as nails. They actually do better in leaner, tougher soils, and in some cases, if you have sedums at home that tend to get tall and floppy, your soil might be too good for them. So benign neglect is my best advice for having good sedums. Love the dark forms like night ember. Notice it in bloom on the right, glossy dark foliage. Here's the case where there's enough green leaf sedums out there where you're waiting for the late season flowers. Why not get golden foliage, variegated foliage, or maroon foliage, where this plant is interesting today as it's emerging out of the soil, offering a contribution all the way through its bloom in late summer. And here's a great example of a new ground cover sedum called Atlantis with absolutely excellent variegation. That's an exciting one. And here you see it. Hopefully you'll find that this year. Still talking about sun perennials, American Gold Rush. If you're into Black-Eyed Susan, and they've gotten a bad rap in the past due to some foliar issues. There was an old award winner called Goldsturm, which is still a beautiful plant, but tends to have all sorts of foliar problems and be a bit of a spreader. American Gold Rush has raised the bar, and it's from a Northern Illinois breeder, Brett Horvath, out of Intrinsic Perennial Farm. That's Hebron, Illinois, not far from where many of you live, I'm sure. But American Gold Rush is perfectly rounded, a little larger than beach ball, absolutely smothered with flowers, and has pubescent foliage. The foliage itself tends to resist a lot of the diseases that perpetuate through other Rudbeckias. This plant is unbelievable. This is not my image. This is from Richard Hawkey at the Chicago Botanic Garden, but what you're seeing there are 12 to 15 individual plants in the heat of summer. Look at the beautiful mounding, and they tend not to splay open. So you have to dedicate a shrub-sized space to these plants, but look at the flower color, and they do this for almost 2 months. So American Gold Rush, look for it. Breeding in Coreopsis, the tick seeds like the same conditions as sedum. And you might recall I said benign neglect, lean soils, full sun. You don't need a lot of composted soils. They bloom heavily. In the past, some of the non-hardy varieties have been forced upon us. A couple of years ago, there were a lot of pink and red ones that came our way that were not hardy. I'll show you all hardy Coreopsis that will offer a long range of summer blooms. Little Bang, there's a whole bunch of different colors in this series, but here thriving along a roadway in a gravelly soil. This is the best red Coreopsis that's out there. It's lasted 5 years in my garden. I've seen it at the Chicago Botanic Garden. One of the verticillata types, the very fine leaf ones. If you've grown Coreopsis, you've probably tried Moonbeam and Zagreb. Those are beautiful yellow forms, but start dabbling with some of these other colors. They're out there and available. Hot Paprika, another excellent selection. Red Hot Vanilla, hints of cream and white. Shasta Daisies. Shasta Daisies, love them for the pure white contribution. This Sweet Daisy Share is one of the newer forms that has a little more cut leaf, more of a cut petal look to it, a little more texture. Do know with leucanthemums, a warning, some are heavy reseeders. Do know the height you're getting into, because you can get leucanthemums that are 4 feet tall or some that are 10 inches tall. That pure white is excellent in the garden, but do understand again some of the needs. Full sun is ideal and great composite for pollinators. I alluded to annual salvias earlier. Remember, you saw Roman red, you saw the blue form. Salvatore blue, which is offered as seed, although you'll also find it as started plants in nurseries. This image doesn't do the plant justice because this is at the tail end of its bloom. It's still reading as blue, but it's finishing. This is now touted as the bluest of the perennial salvias. And this is a Nemorosa type, a meadow sage. So you're talking primarily a spring into early summer bloom. If you grow perennial salvias, do understand, once they get to this stage, you can cut them back. And I mean cut them way back down into the lower foliage. and you'll at least have a tidier plant, but you may get some rebloom. So love the blue in the garden. I alluded to that earlier, how blue is underutilized. I'm a huge fan of this Salvatore blue if you can find it. Rose Marvel is another one of those meadow sages, and this is touted as one of the best lavender pinks. And it blooms for almost 5 to 6 weeks, and excellent out in the garden. So Achillea, this is yarrow. Now, in the past, yarrows have been floppy. They tend to have an issue where the newest flowers have a certain beauty to them, but then age to an ugly version of themselves. And what's nice about this example, the Firefly series, diamond, of course, being the white form, and there's the Firefly series has a wide range of colors. What's nice is the older flowers maintain a really nice degree of their original coloration. Tend to be sturdier stalks. They don't splay open. And so this white tends to read through a good portion of the summer. Same comment about yarrows is if they start having issues of waning in terms of bloom, and they will. This tends to happen in mid to late summer. Cut them down to an inch or two, and you'll get a brand new plant and perhaps new flowering. So you can't kill a yarrow, so don't ever be shy about cleaning them up, as I mentioned with the Salvia. Millie Rock Rose, another yarrow, but quite short in height, about 12 inches. And Peter Cottontail, this is an interesting type of yarrow called sneezewort. This is native to Europe, but look at the very tight buttons here. I don't think this has a lot of pollinator value, but reads very interesting in terms of that flower arrangement. Garden Phlox, wonderful for fragrance. Majority of what you can buy now is mildew resistant, although again, these wet summers we've had tons of mildew issues. This Fashionably early series, Flamingo, is one of many varieties. These plants will take full sun or part sun. What's neat about these garden phlox is they run the range of heights now from 18 inches up to almost 5 feet. So they can be back of the border, they can be mid border or front of the border. They're blooming powerhouses, and if you grow them, you know what I'm talking about. They start blooming typically in July, but you see blooms all the way to August and early September. This is an excellent variety. The Kapow series you see here, this is one of 5, I believe, that are in that 18 to 24 inch range. So you can bring their color and their fragrance into the front of the border, which I think is an excellent opportunity. Heleniums or Helen's flowers, often overlooked. The old forms over the last 20 to 30 years have been tall, with most of the color relegated to the top of a 3 to 4 foot tall plant. The Mariachi series, and I think there's 6 colors now, all in these reds and ambers and yellows, quite short, 18 inches tall. So midsummer bloomers and excellent for pollinators, not a native plant, but ultimately a blooming powerhouse, and very fond of this Mariachi series for heat tolerance. Penstemons. If you've grown penstemons in the past, some of you have seen the sort of this race to have the darkest foliage penstemon, and in the past there's been Husker's Red, and there's been Dark Towers, and a lot of these other varieties that have pretty much what you see here. Dark foliage and nice lavender blooms. DAKOTA Burgundy is another in this series of wonderful penstemons, and I think this is as good as any of those. The benefit is the near black foliage throughout the growing season, but having the wonderful flowers for about 5 weeks in early summer to midsummer. And so cone flowers, echinaceas. And the thing about cone flowers, number one, we're going to look at some hybrids. The Sombrero series, I'll cut to the chase and say this is my favorite series, and I don't get a kickback for saying that. These are all in the 20-inch range. These are hybrids. So the thing about Echinacea purpurea, purple coneflower, or any of the hybrids that have that as part of the parent, as these all do, tend to be short-lived perennials. So you need to know that. So going into this, you're lucky to get 3, 4, 5 years out of them. So it's pretty rare to say, hey, I've had this for 10 years in the garden. However, some of the other Echinacea species, Pallida, paradoxa, some of these other species are longer lived in the garden. A little more research on your part, you'll find some of those, but I think these are worth their salt for their heavy bloom time. Strong stems, because a lot of these funky colors that have come out over the last 15 years have been wimpy stems, floppy. They also have had issues of aging to an ugly color. Similar to my yarrow comment, some of the earlier oranges and really red coneflower hybrids look nasty. They just didn't have stem strength or perpetuation of color. The Sombrero series has it all. And so we're going to go through these, but do know, there's like 200 of these out on the market, and they all look good in the catalogs and the picture tags. Go with what you know, and again, these sombrero ones, Tres Amigos is relatively new, but Baja Burgundy, this Adobe orange you're seeing here is spectacular. I think it's the best orange out there. I've had this for 3 years in my garden. I hope to get more out of it. But look at the heavy flowering count. To my comment earlier, this has old flowers that are a week or two old and brand new ones. But the degree of orange is still maintained. You're not seeing kind of a nasty gradation of color. Salsa red is one of the real nice near red colored ones. Sangrita, I'll let these speak for themselves. I think the Sombrero series now has, I want to say 11 or 12 colors. Granada Gold and Lemon Yellow Improved, a nice yellow. So again, all similar heights. And here's Blanco, which is the white form. Problems with white cone flowers in the past are exactly as I mentioned. The older flowers tend to be brown. So you'd see a composition like this that would be compromised unless you were constantly cutting out brown flowers. This tends to maintain white through a good portion of the season. Prairie drips, so Monardas, bee balms in the mint family, and if you've grown it, you know why that can be an issue. They tend to spread. Not to me, never. It's never been a huge issue. You just need to know the double the real estate. Many have been prone to mildew in our cold and damp summers, but ultimately, there's a lot of great hybrids out there. Prairie Gypsy is one of many. I wanted to show a close-up of the flower, not only for its beauty, but the flower arrangement. Monardas have a whorl of trumpet-shaped flowers. So what you're looking at is about 40 flowers in a whorl. Wonderful for hummingbirds, and Monardas are just great for pollinators in general. They run the gamut of heights. So to my comment about garden phlox earlier, same deal with Monardas. You might want a 12-inch form, you might want a 4-footer. Great colorations out there. Most of what's being offered to you as a consumer is mildew resistant. Pardon My Pink is one of the shorter varieties. Jumping to hibiscus, these are herbaceous hibiscus, meaning if you had this plant at home, it's not showing any growth yet. And that's one of the challenges. Sometimes they look dead. So they do die back to the ground and they don't really emerge until early June when the soil is warm sufficiently. But Cherry Chocolate is one of the nice dark forms. Huge blossoms, and the breeding has been not only for darkness of foliage but more compact form, so getting in that 3, 4, 5 foot range. There's some great varieties out there, all full sun plants, and moisture's very important, as is drainage, but they're excellent in bloom. Perovsky is Russian sage, kind of a ubiquitous plant. You see it in a lot of corporate landscapes. So why do I show denim and lace? Well, breeding over the last decade has been for shorter and shorter Perovskias, and many weren't as short as they were touted. Denim and lace has the benefit of not only being quite short at 22 to 24 inches, but just heavy, heavy flowering. And to me, it's one of my favorites. Here's a nice median planting with 4 or 5 of them. This is past peak. They're extremely drought tolerant, very upright. Some of the taller forms tend to splay open. Huge fan of denim and lace. And if you know Russian sage, it's not truly a herbaceous perennial. It actually will, hopefully doesn't die to the ground. You have budding at some lower portion of the plant. And snow cover helps with that. So your Russian sage outside, you don't ever cut it to the ground. You can cut it to a foot or so and then see where the buds are in spring. Spigelia, an excellent native plant. This is Little Redhead. Great for hummingbirds, a plant that some people have had trouble growing, but I've had quite a bit of success with it. And I'm blanking on the common name, but it's a great perennial to locate. And briefly, some grasses. The thing with ornamental grasses to consider is it's not just a winter thing. You should have a winter that has interest with grasses. Do understand that winter stature is not the same for all grasses. They're not all created equally. Some don't have the stature to withstand snows and such. So they should be components in our compositions throughout the season. So do keep that in mind. Bandwidth, you see some nice horizontal banding on a smaller statured grass. Here's a pennisetum, puppy love. Look at the wonderful inflorescences. Here's a great example of a grass that has no winter stature. This is actually a plant that will be flattened by snows, but is worth its space for the blooms. So hardiness is important. Do know that grasses in time need to be divided. Many of our perennials, that original spot you put a perennial, and I'll use grasses as an example, the most vigorous growth is on the outer portion of the plant itself. And ultimately, that interior gets vacated, so you get a donut look. This happens to hostas, it happens to grasses, and that's usually an indication this time of year. If you have donuts of perennials, it's time to divide. And blonde ambition, a native grass, this Boutelotte is from the eastern plains of the Rockies, hardy, drought tolerant, and in this case, notice the floating inflorescences. Very interesting in terms of its architecture and can withstand some light snows, but again, quite interesting. Folks, I apologize. I'm going to have to take a quick bathroom break. I didn't anticipate that, but I'm going to walk away from my computer for about 30 seconds. I hope you'll bear with me, and we'll hit the ground running here very shortly. Thank you.
Thank you all again so much for joining us. This is Sam again. I just wanted to input, since we've got a quick pause here, that the handout, the list of all of the plants that Mark is talking about today can be found on our website, clem.org. If you had registered through Zoom, I know some are watching through Facebook Live, but if you registered through Zoom, in the email sent prior to tonight's program, there will be the link to our website. Otherwise, just check out clem.org and find today's event, and you'll find the slide handout with the list of all the plants. Just wanted to put that in here quick while we've got a pause.
All righty, I'm back. Thank you. Okay, well, we're going to dive right back in. So yeah, Blonde Ambition, just a great grass. This is a variety. Actually, the flowers are typically darker, but Blonde Ambition is a selection that has lighter inflorescences or flowers. Totem pole, Panicum totem pole. So panicums are switchgrasses, a great native grass, Panicum virgatum. Totem pole is known for being quite narrow, and this is a great example of knowing the form of a grass, because some grasses are narrow, as you see here. Many panicums, though, have an arcing or vase-shaped habit. So when you consider the elbow room those grasses take up as they emerge from a small spot and then arc outwards, that becomes important to consider when you're spotting or placing plants. So do keep that in mind. And to my earlier comment, when a grass expands and has that donut, what happens is a lot of that outer growth, when you have nothing in the center, tends to splay open as well. So consider the real estate, again, that these grasses will encompass. And again, it goes well beyond their winter interests. There are also grasses with absolutely wonderful fall color. There's a lot of native grasses now that have the benefit of attracting wildlife, and I think we're going to get into some of those. So I realize I'm rambling on here, so we're going to keep going at a good clip. And here's a great example of a native grass. This is Schizocarium or little blue stem. There's a wide range of varieties out there that are being selected for a more increased blue summer look. It naturally, little blue stem has a little blue to it, but this is extremely blue. Standing ovation is a nice upright form, but you can get compact forms at 18 to 24 inches, or those that have more increased fall color, which is like an orangey red. So Andropogon, here's big blue stem, and this isn't something I would have promoted for the garden 10 years ago, because these were sort of dedicated to prairie restorations, naturalistic renovations, but now they really lend themselves as a taller grass in the landscape. And this is a fall shot of big blue stem, red bull being selected for increased fall color. The fall color big blue stem is a little kind of an orangey pink, but red bull started to raise the bar about 8 years ago. And I'll show you some fun new ones coming up. But the comment about the selection of a plant like this is an example of a nativar. And some of you have heard that term. It's a native plant, Andropogon gerardii, so big blue stem, native. But here's a variety that was selected. This was seen out in the wild somewhere and then selected and propagated. So it's a native plant that has now become a cultivated variety, hence nativar. And that term is used for a lot of different plants. But back to Andropogon, dancing wind. Look at the red on this. This is a late summer shot. It almost reads like a red twig dogwood here in this is a November shot where it's still showing some great color at Rotary Gardens, and very upright. Accounting for the size is important because this is 6 to 7 feet, and Blackhawks is currently the darkest. And look at the difference from Dancing Wind with the bright red to Blackhawks with this deep maroon. Here's a row of it at the Chicago Botanic Garden in October. And look at this wonderful composition. This is at Olbrich Botanical Gardens in Madison, Wisconsin. And I'm sure it was placed there. Notice the golden Chamaecyparis to the back right. Here's a case where that maroon, that dark color, that depth is augmented by the light neighbor. Clematis, Rigucci, I'm not showing you a lot of vining plants, but this, I took pictures of this plant over the course of 4 months. And many clematis, they're all, I think, all beautiful. And do know your clematis because there's some that are pruned certain times of the year, some you don't prune back in winter. Rigucci will bloom on new growth, but the comment here is this thing was blooming from June, July, August, and September with exquisite dangling blossoms. I think one of the more vigorous clematis. To woody plants, we're going to dive right in and go to, again, a good clip. I see the time here. So breeding in panicled hydrangeas. Now, this isn't the rounded puffball type, the smooth hydrangeas, which a lot of us have in shady locations. The breeding in those, incidentally, is amazing. But the panicled hydrangeas need, number one, a lot of sun, a lot of water. They're one of the first woody plants to wilt on you. But the breeding for these, notice the upright flower forms are indicative of this species of hydrangea, but they're being selected for different gradations of coloration on the blooms themselves. And using this as an example, some are being selected. All these varieties go through a progression of the earliest flowers being green, going to a white, going to a pink, and then a brown. And that's usually over 2 to 3 months. But there are varieties being picked for more pink or more lime or a longer degree of pink or a darker pink. And I'll show you some examples, but it's important to know the height of these because you can get panicled hydrangeas that will get 3 feet high and some that'll get 12 to 15 feet high. So let's dive in here. This is what they look like in winter. This is the trial at the Chicago Botanic Garden. So new growth will push off those flowers. You don't have to deadhead those. You can if you want, but I actually like this look through the winter, to be honest. But it's getting back to their summer look. So Phantom is one of my favorites for massive white flowers. And there are ways of pruning these. Don't ever cut these way back. And I've seen it done where they get a lot of lanky new growth and then are floppy. If you ever decide to prune them back, you make a lot of cuts. You cut them back in half, but you make a ton of cuts. And that should be a talk for another time, but Phantom's a nice one. Here's a case where Vanilla Strawberry's having more hints of pink to it. And there's a lot of fancy names out there, but I think they're all good plants. Bobo is one that is in that 3 to 4 foot range. So a lot of folks can't fit these types of hydrangeas maybe along the house because they feel that 8 to 10 feet is too big. Here's a case where this will fit under most windows. Again, full sun or part sun's okay, but full sun is ideal for these hydrangeas. Little Lime. So the variety Limelight came out 15 years ago, a taller form, which I've seen at 12 feet tall. Little Lime is in that 5 to 6 foot range and has a long degree of lime coloration, in this case heading to a little pink. Here's Limelight. That's a great example of that degree of lime. That's, I think, still one of my favorites. The issue is the height. You can keep the taller ones in check, but do know how to prune them based on my earlier comments. And Pinky Winky's another great one for a long degree of pink coloration. Little Lamb's another shorter form at 5 to 6 feet. There are literally 50 plus varieties out there. Many, I have to admit, look the same. I'm trying to show you some of the ones I think look significantly different. So diving into some other woody plants, this is not my image, this is a borrowed shot. Centara Double Blue. So when we talk about syringas or lilacs, for you and for us in Janesville, they should be looking really good starting this weekend. Fragrance is certainly vital. Most of us love the smell of lilacs in bloom, but a lot of the old French lilacs, they're ungainly in terms of height, in that 12 to 15 foot range with thick canes and mildew issues. So the breeding in more compact forms of lilacs in that 6 to 8 to 9 foot range, more medium-sized shrubs, is out there, and it's exciting to see that. There's also a lot of breeding in what are called reblooming lilacs. There's the Bloomerang series. I think there's 4 or 5 colors in that series. I'll jump to the chase and say, don't be fooled by, they do rebloom, but never to the intensity of the spring wave, meaning they look great through spring, and the idea that they bloom through the entire summer is not true. You'll see a couple scattered blooms through the season, but it's never the same as the spring. Not to say that's unwelcome, but do know what you're getting into. Virtual violet's another one with semi-double flowers. Here's a close-up of the blooms. If you're looking around at lilacs, this weekend, actually, I'm going up to the UW Arboretum, Longnecker Gardens in Madison, which is open, incidentally, and you can wander through. They have the largest lilac collection in the Midwest, and hopefully I'll find this one as well. But I love the fragrance, and we do realize mildew might be an issue. There's no such thing as a mildew-proof lilac, but these more compact forms are exciting. Weigelas, sometimes called Weigelias. If you've grown these, there's a wide range of selections that have maroon foliage, some of the older forms with green foliage. Love the variegated forms. They tend to be a little floppy in their habit. If you've grown them, you know what I'm saying. They're not naturally rounded. Do not be shy about a little snipping here and there, and you can actually shape and form these into nice, perfect mounds. And sometimes they need that because you can have branches with different stem lengths. But back to Magical Fantasy, here's the case with nice, clean, variegated foliage. Weigelas all have beautiful trumpet-shaped blossoms in late spring until early summer. There's actually some yellow blooming ones that are out there, but the majority are in the pink or the deep red. Here's Magical Fantasy in bloom. So the nice thing about variegated plants, and I alluded to this earlier with some perennials, the Brunneras in particular, is, yeah, it's great to see the flowers, but that variegated foliage is carrying the show from emergence all the way till hard frost. In the Checkmark trilogy, look at the heavy flowering on these. These are literally out of Czechoslovakia, and what's neat is you see the newest flowers are the deepest pink, and they're aging to a very light pink. So you almost get 3 colors on this. There's a close-up of the blooms. A native plant, buttonbush, Cephalanthus. Cephalanthus naturally likes riparian environments. It'll actually grow in standing water, swampland. It actually can adapt to a wide range of soils. What's excellent about it is not only the Sputnik-like flowers here, and unfortunately I've been ridiculed with some recent presentations about its unfortunate resemblance to the coronavirus, but we'll get off that topic quickly here. Why is fiber optics of interest? It's a compact form. So the native straight species is getting 12 to 15 feet tall. That's large shrub, small tree size. Fiber optics is in that 6 to 8 foot range, so a little more adaptable to the home landscape. And there's some other varieties out there as well, but this is blooming in early summer. And those flowers age brown with that same look. It actually is great for pollinators as well and gets a yellow fall color. Here it is in a landscape situation. This is past peak, but if you look closely, uncompromised glossy foliage, very few insect and disease problems, and the flowering I think is exceptional. They can be trimmed and shaped, and again adapted to a wide range of soils. Calycanthus. So this is a hybrid. Hartlage wine for years was thought not to be hardy here. And turns out it is. And here's a shrub that's going to get 8 to 12 feet, but it blooms. And for perspective, these are 2-inch diameter blooms. It blooms from late May, very shortly here, all the way sporadically through the entire summer. This can get quite large. It does have a very light fragrance. If you know Carolina Allspice, that's one of the parents. So I think the fragrance is over-promoted in our climate, to be honest. You have to be right up on it to experience it. But what I really enjoy is having those flowers. And here they are opening, kind of like a tulip. This is a specimen up at Olbrich, but I could photograph this over the course of 3 months. And again, just wonderful blossoms. And there's its fall color. So when you think about, again, sacred real estate in your garden, this applies to your woody plants too. You're getting beautiful spring flowers, nice clean foliage, and fall color. You're covering some great seasons there. And a comment about cotinus, the smoke bushes. Winecraft black is a compact form of purple smoke bush. And if you know royal purple, that's one that's been around forever. Smoke bush is having the name because of what you see here, the wispy inflorescences. Royal purple had an issue of just getting too large, so it could be cut back severely. The issue with cutting these back is you lose the flowers for the next year. So Winecraft black getting in the 8 to 10 foot range solves that in terms of being medium to tall height. but also having the benefit of the foliage. I love deep maroon in the landscape and consider its value up against or near a tan structure or a yellow structure, but also combining it with adjacent bright colors, using this dark color as a foil. There's also a Winecraft Gold. Here it is, another compact form of a gold cotinus. I will say cotinus, we've had some issues with verticillium wilt, which is a problem that can kill these off fairly quickly if it's in your soil, but that's not necessarily a sure thing. I just want to warn you, we've had these looking good and then had some issues, but I love cotinus in general. And the Velvet Fog is not coming out till next year, but another very compact form, and I believe this is a hybrid cotinus. Love the wispy flowers. Do consider them for your landscape. Katsura trees, not a native plant, and I show you red fox. If you've not grown Katsura trees, number one, no insect or disease problems. They're native to Asia. Heat and drought tolerant. They're actually pollution tolerant. They tend to get quite wide with age, but are narrow early on. Red fox has the benefit of maroon foliage in spring. This goes to a kind of maroonish green later on. Here's a plant in Janesville. This is quite a young one, but again, that in midsummer and the heat of summer is a little more green to it. But Katsura trees are just tough as nails, and they also have a beautiful fall color. The green leaf forms get a beautiful yellow. This will get kind of an orangey maroon, and just an odd little twist. Right when the leaves are dropping in fall, they emit a fragrance of cotton candy, which is just amazing. And Parkland pillar, here's a birch. Now, birches in our climates, the white bark birches get a bad rap because the hot summers, the fact that people are open planting them, you know, they do well in the north woods of Wisconsin because they're more relegated to understory situations, but they have a lot of insect and disease problems in our area as well. So why am I showing Parkland pillar? Well, number one, the form being quite narrow. So you have the benefit of very narrow plant for those tight spots or the corner of your home, the neat white bark, but also this is insect and disease resistant. So you don't have the same issues as the standard paper birch, which is the one that tends to have a lot of the problems. So when you think about form, it's important to understand some of your favorite plants, whether it's an oak tree, a maple, a birch. If you think, boy, I don't have the room for a standard sized version of this plant, understand there's frequently compact forms, narrow forms, weeping forms. Get into some of these interesting shapes. And here it is, a taller form with its late season fall color. So that's 20 feet tall and about 4 feet wide, and accommodating ultimately that width. I love narrow plants in the landscape because they become exclamation points, and they not only lend themselves to tight spots, they are excellent focal points. And briefly, some conifers. You know, with conifers, if you have deer issues, you have to be careful, particularly with thuya. These are arborvitae. Pancake's interesting because of its texture and its form, but of course there's a lot of critters that will nibble on these thuya, so be careful, know what you're getting into. Understand with evergreens, the contribution is 365 days a year. Unless it's a deciduous evergreen, which is a separate topic, things like larches and bald cypress. But the blues of many of our conifers, the yellows, many conifers get a late season color through the winter. Understand they're not just the bones of the garden, they are contributors in your compositions throughout the landscape, throughout the season. And that gets well beyond the ubiquitous yews and junipers that we all had planted around our homes 40 years ago. You know, we need to expand kind of our palette. Here's another thuya. This Phillips Magic Moment is a compact golden arborvitae. Again, the same issue with deer, but in this case, something that has a very tight form and those wonderful gold highlights. And I'm a huge sucker for gold conifers. I love gold in the landscape, but tempering it with maroons and blues and other colors helps bring those warm colors down. But the developments in conifers for foundations in particular, moving away from some of the more common evergreens is amazing to watch as well. Gin Fizz is another relatively new juniper, and this is its natural form. The thing about junipers, not only heat and drought tolerant, they'll take our hot summers, that's not an issue. The warning, unfortunately, the palette for deer has changed. At Rotary Gardens for years, junipers, spruce, chamaecyparis, many of the different pines were left alone by deer, but their expanding palette is now encompassing some of these plants. So I tend to be focused on deer damage with some of these things, but there's a lot of wonderful junipers like Gin Fizz that are wonderful for screens, particularly in full sun areas with tough soils that you might not have the ability to irrigate or frequently water. Great for wildlife, particularly those berries. So look into some of the junipers. Some of the more upright forms are excellent for a wide range of purposes. And here's an upright yew, Taxus stonehenge. In this case, there's many upright yews. Deer can also be a problem for these, but in this case, nice around the foundation. This will continue to gain height, so you can top it off at any height you find desirable, but that naturally narrow form becomes that exclamation point in the landscape. Or imagine a series of these planted as a pseudo hedge. So I'm winding down. The image here is at Rotary Gardens. This is a saucer magnolia. These are finishing up. The cold weather's brutalized these. Before I jump to the questions, and I know some of you may not, I've gone over time. I tend to continue to chatter here, but I'll try to get to some of the questions online. But I do want to say I really appreciate the Clem Arboretum having me involved with this presentation, and do support your local botanic gardens. I'll use Rotary Gardens as an example. What's happened due to current world events is not only not having visitation during the busiest time of year, but having our volunteers sidelined, weddings canceled through a huge portion of the year, special events canceled. So as a nonprofit, it's a huge challenge for not only the gardens, but all nonprofits. And for places of beauty like this, places of respite, do support your local gardens and your local nurseries and garden centers. And beyond my discussion today, I'll try to answer a couple questions, which will likely be, I think I'm new to some of the tech, but I think I can still verbalize as I look at some of these questions. Do feel free to sign off, but do email me beyond today if you have another questions on anything you've heard or seen. And if you did not get that handout, that'll be instrumental in kind of reviewing some of the things we looked at. I did just barely scratch the surface of some of the new and exciting plant material out there, but have fun with your gardening season. Stay safe, everyone. And I'm going to click on these questions and see if I can answer these. Thank you for your time. Okay, I see a question from Paul saying, are the new impatiens great in shade? And I'll answer that verbally. Yes, so that Beacon series, it's the same deal. The standard Impatiens Walleriana, you saw that bed at Rotary Gardens, that's in a lot of shade. We used to put 4,000 Impatiens in there every year, and of course you saw what happened to them. The Beacon series and that other series I couldn't quite remember at the time are the same for full shade. They're absolutely excellent. In fact, those are Impatiens I would not put in any great degree of sun. It's the Sun Patient series of the New Guineas that I mentioned can take some sun, as can that Bounce and Big Bounce series. And again, the offerings with these Impatiens, you should see them at most garden centers. You'll see the color range expand too. And I like to say in 3 to 5 years, we'll be back to growing. All these Impatiens will be mildew resistant, and hopefully we'll be back on board, because it was a huge hit to the nursery industry as well. So do explore those series. Paul has another question here. What are the best annuals for shade? Well, we talked about some of the Impatiens and some of the Begonias. There's another plant I did not show, and you'll find this in some of your seed catalogs, called Browalia, and that's Browallia, Browalia. It's a plant that comes in both blue and white blossoms. It takes a ton of shade. You can find it in most seed catalogs. I would hazard a guess that you won't find it in your area garden centers. If you do, that's great, but it's easy to grow from seed. So Browalia, also called cup flower, can take a ton of shade. Another excellent two other plants to look for are Plectranthus, Plectranthus, the variety Mona Lavender, or Velvet Elvis. So there are Plectranthus that take quite a bit of sun, but if you can find Plectranthus, Mona Lavender, or Velvet Elvis, these have lavender flowers. They were a house plant in South Africa is their original history. Taking a low light house plant was their original history. So Plectranthus, Velvet Elvis, and Mona Lavender are awesome in shade, as is a plant called Persian Shield, or Strobilanthes. So again, excellent. And I would encourage you, I'm scratching the surface on shade tolerant annuals. And Paul, whether you're still listening or others that are hearing me, email me and I can send you plenty more. There's a lot of great annuals. And to my comment earlier about shade, most of these annuals have a huge foliar component as well, as they're blending with perennials and offering that illumination, that interest in very shaded areas. So do keep that in mind. Okay, well, I see those are the two questions I had. I see our participants dwindling. Again, I want to say thanks to everyone. I'm going to stay on the line here to talk to Sam to make sure we have some closure. Hopefully you'll be able to get out in your gardens and have some fun, and hopefully this got you inspired to do so. Thanks again for your time, everyone.
Thank you all so much for joining us.